Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right, everyone, welcome back to Nets in the Water, stoking the flame of Catholic education. Super excited to have on today Emily Fisher. Emily is the foundress. Can I say that? You're the foundress of St. Thomas Aquinas Academy in Tampa, the first, to my knowledge, first classical school.
The first classical Catholic school, yes.
Classical Catholic school. Okay. Yeah, I'm really excited to get into kind of just what a classical Catholic education is, what that means. It's a word I've heard tossed around a lot, but I don't know the specifics of. But before I get into that, I'm very curious how your life led to this point. I don't really know much about you other than that you founded this school. So I'm very curious to see kind of where the Lord worked to lead you there.
Yeah, it was definitely not my aim to start a school. That was never like a dream I had as a kid growing up. But I think it really began with our own children and just trying to figure out how we were going to raise them and how we were going to form them. And at the time, had really developed a daily prayer life, and I really felt God calling me to homeschool. So that was sort of the first, I guess, call within a call, if you will. And that's when I got exposed to classical Catholic education by means of a hybrid program, which was wonderful. And I just became deeply convicted that full-time families who were, not homeschooling or didn't feel like it was their capacity or their call to homeschool, they needed to have access to a classical Catholic education here in Tampa. So, and it was like, somebody should do that. And then the Holy Spirit was like, you should do that. So I guess that's what set me on the path. I read an article about a school called Sacred Heart Academy in Grand Rapids, Michigan, that actually has a full-time program and a hybrid program, does a classical liberal arts curriculum and daily mass, and just the beautiful fruit that they were seeing. It was kind of like, wow, okay, I think this is something that, this is maybe what I've been looking for, and has served as a model and a partner for us as we've developed St. Thomas Aquinas.
So this is your first year. You just opened this year, correct?
We opened this year. We have 54 students from pre-K 3 through 6th grade. We're going into 7th next year. So, God has really provided, and it's been great.
Now, before you started the school, what were you doing? Were you a full-time stay-at-home mom?
So I was a stay-at-home mom. Before that, I was a school psychologist. So I do have a background in education. So I worked very closely with our administrators and doing testing and helping students qualify for special education services and things like that, school-wide behavior programs, individual and group counseling. So that I didn't really know how the Lord was going to use that. And when I started to stay home, I knew that was the right thing for us. But, I always had this background in education, and it's been interesting to see things that I never could have anticipated that the Lord has made good use of.
Yeah. It's a very cool response of like, oh, someone should do that. And then the Lord prompts you to do it. It's a very it almost feels like he's calling us out sometimes, because I'm right there with you where it's like, I mean, even working here, I'm like, man, like someone should do a podcast, or someone should do like this sort of video thing. And then next thing you know, here it is.
Mm-hmm. And my prayer as we were beginning, because, starting a school is a big endeavor, and it's taken a lot of time and many people's, not only my own, many people's effort. And my prayer was always, Lord, if you really want this to happen, if this is not my will, but it's actually your will, just open the doors and make it happen. Because there were so many things that I could not control, even if I wanted to. The bishop's approval, which was such a gift. Father Sal, who's the pastor at St. Patrick's Catholic Church, which has welcomed us onto their campus and into their building. There were so many things. So, the Lord answered my prayer by opening the doors. And similarly, I said, Lord, if this isn't your will, just close the doors, just so that I know this is not what you want me to do. And, this is, just wanting to make sure it wasn't an idea I had sitting in front of my prayer candles, that it was really the Lord speaking to me. So he confirmed that by opening up the doors.
That's great. So conviction to start classical education. The question that I had, the $1 million question, the 45-minute question is what is a classical education? I at least kind of know like there's like a de-emphasis on technology, maybe that's a misconception. There's like it's kind of holistic. I don't really know much about it. So what are some things that you would say are characteristic of this?
So the end of a classical education is the cultivation of wisdom and virtue.
Is
by
that an Emily
means
Fisher phrase, or is that like classical education?
that would be a classical education world phrase. But of course, like,
Okay.
what's your elevator pitch for classical education
Yeah.
is $1 million question, even in the classical education world. But yes, the goal is the cultivation of wisdom and virtue by means of the liberal arts and sciences toward the end of students attaining salvation and fulfilling their vocation here on earth. So
Okay, I feel like there's a lot of steps we can break down in there. Of first is attaining wisdom and virtue. Not first, but like in the way that you
Yes.
in your sentence.
Yeah.
Wisdom and virtue, then attain heaven. Was that the next thing you said? Then vocation.
through by means of the liberal arts and
means of
sciences.
the liberal
So
arts and sciences.
you know,
Okay.
we do that through, in the midst of academic work.
Okay, so to start kind of working through this elevator pitch, wisdom and virtue. How does that get incorporated into a classroom in classical education as opposed to a regular Catholic education? What does that difference look like?
I don't know, I wouldn't speak to what other schools are doing, but just in terms of, the classical approach, really that, the goal is not just knowledge or technical skills, but that we know how to live a good life. We know if we ought to do something. We can certainly learn the skills of how to do something, but taking a step to first, train souls in virtue to, be responsible, to be courageous, to be prudent, so that when they're faced with, when they are equipped with technical skills, that they know whether or not they ought to use them in a certain way toward a certain end, if that's actually God's will, if that's actually the right thing to do. So, I think that emphasis on virtue and being wise and knowing what we ought to do, not just how to do things, is definitely a big emphasis in a classical education.
So it sounds like the difference of what makes a classical education like different from a regular education or like standard Catholic schooling is not so much maybe not what you do. It's more about how you do things than what you do in the physical sense of it. Like it sounds like it's a pretty standard school day in that understanding, but it's kind of how you fill in those blanks of the day that makes it a classical school versus like a standard Catholic school.
We're, I think all have the same goal. We have a zeal for souls. We want to create more saints for heaven. In a classical school, like the methods and kind of maybe what the content is focused on is going to be a little bit different. Really see that, in some ways as like clearing out some of things that can be distracting and just like focusing on the best and most beautiful.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, baseline of it, it's like, first off, daily mass is beautiful. That's just a beautiful way to like zero in on things. Then they go to class where it looks similar in schedule, but very different in curriculum and in instruction and in the kind of environment of it. To take this back to these specifics, they grow in virtue through curriculum being focused on like, is this virtuous? Is this not virtuous? What kind of books are we reading? Like, how do they portray virtue? Is that similar in your approach to wisdom of like, it sounds like within the wisdom is more of like not teaching them things that they need to know, but how to think about things.
Well, it's interesting. Yeah. And I think one of the benefits of a classical education is that you learn to read and think deeply. There was an article in the Atlantic this fall, a college professor, I think it was at Columbia, said that, one of his students came to him and was basically saying that the workload was way too much because they were expected to read like a book a week. And the student came to him and said, I've only read articles and excerpts. I was never assigned an entire book cover to cover. And so I think one of the things that classical education does emphasize is certainly there is the use of textbooks, is what we call like a spine text, in history to guide you through the progression of, a historical period. But really focusing on, reading a whole novel, looking at the primary text of, the Constitution instead of just reading a little excerpt in your textbook. So being able to get through a whole, document that might be difficult, that the vocabulary might be advanced, and certainly like your teacher is there as your guide to walk you through that. But those skills of, sort of that TLDR syndrome, it's like, we want them to be able to read a whole long form article or a whole book and really think about something deeply instead of kind of thinking in a tweet segment.
Yeah. What makes all of this? Because the way you're describing it, like if you didn't tell me it was a classical school, I'd be like, oh, it's just a very good standard Catholic school. What makes it at its core a classical school?
Well, I think too, I wouldn't focus so much on the word classical. I mean, there are schools and, we arrived at using that term in, certain way, but like the term classical, I would say it certainly has connotations that are helpful. And I think when parents are looking for something that is a little bit more tech light, that does, really curate the content of the curriculum in terms of like the literature that's being read and things like that. But yeah, some schools use liberal arts, some use classical, some, won't use that terminology at all, but they'll be doing the same things that we are. So, it's not necessarily that like, oh, classical's this way and other Catholic schools are that way, but, it's just a word that we've used to describe ourselves that's helpful as we share about, our approach with parents, and, try to give them a sense of who we are and the way we do things.
So it's more of an adjective than it is like a classification. It's not the same, because like, to put this into context, is like I went to a Jesuit high school, and there are things that kind of means in the way that they went about the education that was like, this is what makes it Jesuit. It sounds like this isn't the same in terms of like, there's not like a framework of like, this is what it, like this is the mandatory of being a classical school. It more just sounds like certain schools use the word classical to describe what they're doing, but it's not so much like a uniform framework.
It's certainly not going to be super uniform. I do think, there is some meaning to it, and it does definitely, time-tested content. For instance, our literature, you probably won't find a book that's less than 50 years old because, sort of the idea is like we want it to stand the test of time, like being found worthy of being handed on. And the methods, I would say, like the instructional delivery, like, memorization, recitation, narration, Socratic discussion, like these things have been used to form minds and souls for thousands of years and have, been handed on in the tradition to us. So like there is a difference. I just, our goal isn't so much to say like, oh, they're like this and we're like this, but just to, share who we are and, encourage others to see the beauty of what we have to offer.
Okay. I feel like the framework of what a classical school is like slowly building up in my mind of like, it is a type of education. You do it by focusing on a more holistic approach, kind of more traditional literature and way of educating. It sounds like you're describing the way that like I hear schools described in like textbooks of how it used to be hundreds of years ago, of like there was not like a uniform way that people did things. It was just how these people chose to confer a way of living onto the next generation.
Yeah.
I think so much like these are the tests you take and therefore you're schooled.
Yeah, I think that's really accurate because certainly, education is like an initiation into a culture. And we take that, as I remember reading that actually on another classical school website, that part of their mission was handing on culture. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And as I've reflected on it, I find that to be very true. These are, methods of being and ways of living and understanding your own history. I mean, understanding biblical history as just history and the incarnation as the focal point of history. Learning about, beautiful art and music compositions and works of literature. Like you're initiated into what's called the Great Conversation. And, until you receive that, you don't walk into the middle of a conversation and just start talking. You sit and you listen for a little bit, and then you're able to, jump in and give your own contribution. So, the goal of a classical education, I think, is to acculturate students to, what's been happening in their own culture, catching them up to speed, so to speak, so that they are, equipped to then participate in the conversation and add in their own generation, like see, from the arc of history, there's nothing new under the sun. And I think also knowing, how different conflicts were solved or different ideologies that have risen and fallen, and then you see things happen today. I think you're a lot more ideology resistant when you know your history. And you also, I think, are better equipped to solve the problems of your own time when you have that historical perspective. So that's what we want for our students. It's not to live in the past, but to really be caught up to speed so that they are equipped to solve the problems of our time and to be the saints for today.
I've never heard that kind of idea of a school just being like, acculturating the students, getting them up to speed. And then, because in that way, it almost makes the entirety of their education a form of history class in a way that gives them a framework to think about their life moving forward.
Yes.
Okay. This is it. I feel the house getting built.
Okay.
Okay. To take this back to where we were, I was way too thirsty to get into the elevator pitch. Now I feel more ready to ask this. Okay. Virtue, wisdom, got that. Check. Next part of your elevator pitch was about through liberal arts and sciences. Mm-hmm. We've kind of touched on that, but just to get back into this, because I think you hear the word liberal arts and you just hear the word liberal, and at least politically, you start to think of this.
Liberal in the original Latin sense of like to free the human person, liberating.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's dive into that. This is worth diving into. Because I feel like I've vaguely heard this, but what does it actually mean?
So, like you're not truly free to use, I think Edward Sri had a video out about this on Formed. Like you're not truly free to play the piano until you learn the discipline and the skills of playing the piano. So like, are you truly free to write until you've read great writing, until you've practiced, the excellence of, knowing how to use grammar, and spelling and penmanship? It's like you're not actually free to do something until you have that obedience to learn kind of the rules of the game, and then you're free to create, and then you're free to add, if that makes sense.
No, it definitely does. And this is something within the faith even that I'm very passionate about, that like people talk about like the rules of our faith as if it's like, well, then I'm less free. Like I can't do these things I want to do because then I have to follow these rules.
No, you're either a slave to sin or, you're a slave for Christ.
Exactly.
There's two options.
I mentioned this on the podcast before, but there's an analogy that I was told in high school of like, if you were really, really good at basketball and they just got rid of the rules of basketball and people just started throwing punches, a guy brings a baseball bat, starts whacking people, someone's like throwing a volleyball at the backboard, all of a sudden you're not free to play basketball.
Absolutely.
Because you've lost the framework of what it is. The same way of life. If the kids don't understand, or the students don't understand the framework and the rules, so to speak, of life, then they're not actually free to live it. The only thing they're free to do is become completely
slaves to their own
enslaved.
passions.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So by liberal,
so we want them to be
free.
We want to help create free men and women who are, going to serve God and have mastery over themselves with God's grace, so that they can be free to be good husbands, good wives, fathers, religious men and women, priests.
Okay, that things are unlocking.
I'm glad to hear it.
Okay, so through liberal arts and sciences, the next part of it was I'm going to start here and say it was to live out their vocation, to fulfill their vocation.
Yes.
What does a vocational emphasis look like in a classroom? Is it like every other day you're like, hey, don't forget you could be a priest one day? Or is it like, how does that work? How does this look?
I think it's a little bit softer than that.
Yeah, I'm sure.
But, certainly, I'll reflecting on my own experience, it was definitely, what do you want to be when you grow up? And the pressure of like having to choose the perfect thing, or, taking the inventory and seeing like the thousands of different jobs listed and being like, am I going to choose the right thing? And sort of giving, again, that freedom of like, the Lord knows you and loves you, and he's calling you to a certain vocation. And it's going to be an adventure, learning what that is. And he's going to, put people in your life, and, he's going to speak to you in prayer, and there are going to be all these ways that he guides you and leads you. But it's nothing that you have to stress about. What should I do? Like, the Lord has a plan for you, and it's a good plan. And there are a lot of people who are here to help you discern what that is and how you're going to serve him and how you're going to be a saint. Because that's really, more important than like, oh, how am I a wheel in the cog of society? Like, what's my, thing that I can do?
So how does that look practically speaking? Is it like you kind of train your teachers on how to bring these things up? How do you practically incorporate that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes to hiring teachers who are witnesses and who are well-formed, so that they can just take those teachable moments and talk about, or they're, talking about vocations, and they're saying like, maybe God will call you to be, like I say to my boys, maybe he'll call you to be a father and a husband. Maybe he'll call you to be a priest. Like, I don't know. It's going to be exciting. Like, so yeah. And certainly with vocation too, looking beyond just, what's your kind of primary vocation call, but really equipping them with the skills that they need, with the knowledge that they need, being able to, again, speak and write and think with clarity and beauty, so that they are, going to be equipped to actually do the work that they need to do, or learn the skills that they need to learn to do whatever particular service God's going to call them to, make a Catholic media company, whatever it might be. We want them to be ready to do that and, equipped with whatever, educational basis that they need for that.
And all of this points to me, like the exclamation point on the whole thing, or like the baseline of it all of this is done to assist the students in attaining heaven.
Absolutely.
That's
Yes.
the end of
I
it.
mean, it's certainly like more saints for heaven, like if we just send students to prestigious colleges and they don't care about their faith or have a relationship with God, I, certainly would not consider that a success.
Yeah.
I mean, we want them to be able to be leaders in their communities, absolutely, to, be able to give back and again, achieve their vocations, their earthly vocations, but really in the service of whatever God is calling them to do to be saints in heaven, because it's through those earthly vocations that God is going to, form them and call them closer to him. So we want them to be equipped for that, but in the final service of becoming a citizen of heaven.
So it seems to me that a lot of the kind of difference in the way that things are done, or at least the way that these certain things are emphasized, happen through the choice of curriculum, the careful hiring of teachers, of formators, and an incorporation of the sacraments. Does that seem like it? Does that kind of summate what's going on well? Am I missing something there?
No, I think, those are three, very important hallmarks of the approach.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay. Now, if I was to kind of zoom out from this, from like, all right, I'm in a classical educational environment, this is what it looks like. What would you say to an educator who says, like, all right, this all sounds well and good. I'm maybe not at a classical school, but I'm just at even a public school maybe. What would be your advice of how to incorporate these sorts of things and goals and virtues into a non-classical education environment?
Yeah, I mean, to the extent that teachers, have ability to influence, like maybe say the text that they're reading or things like that, they could certainly have a preference for reading a whole book versus, reading excerpts from a textbook, for one. And I think too, pointing students to that which is ennobling, surrounding them with beautiful literature, art, music. On your walls, you can put beautiful classical sacred art. You can, while the students are doing independent work, put on beautiful uplifting music. I think there's different ways that you can do that as an educator, no matter what your situation is. Although, of course, I think if your whole school is building a culture that's going in one direction, that's obviously going to be something that's going to be reinforced from your administrator and just with your colleagues too.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting the way that it seems the more I've talked to people about Catholic education, that, and it's kind of obvious, but then it's also kind of not, that like the real cornerstone of all of this is well-formed and passionate educators, which makes sense when I think about it. And maybe you'll have some pushback on this, but I think it's easy to get caught up in like, oh, if only my school taught this, or if only like my school sent us to daily mass, a beautiful thing. But it sounds like I don't want to even say this because then it's like the most important thing are the sacraments. But the cornerstone of this difference is built upon educators who understand the nuance of including these sorts of goals. Because a lot of these goals you're describing aren't, like, it's not like there's like these crazy overt differences. It's more about like you understand the nuance differences to include it in the way you teach.
I would say that's true. I'm not sure who said it, but I've heard it said that, a school is first a faculty. that it doesn't really matter, you could, like I, previously said, like you could have the greatest books, but if you don't have people who are, have a heart for the Lord and have a desire to, bring souls to Christ, like, okay, great. You can have the best text, but it doesn't matter if you're not formed enough to, when something comes up in conversation in your classroom, to take advantage of that time and make a connection for the students or help them to make a connection. So yeah, absolutely. And I think no matter what kind of Catholic school you teach in, hiring people who love Christ and want to bring souls to Christ and love their students enough to bring them to Christ is really essential.
Yeah, I mean, the difference that makes is also just so, it just seems so foundational to the formation of young people that the people educating them have a passion for loving them and educating them well.
Yes, because even if you don't like science, but you have a really excited science teacher who just loves their what they're teaching, loves biology, you start to love biology a little bit because their enthusiasm shines through. So the same for teachers who love their faith and who love Christ.
Now, specifically in the religious education aspect of a classical school, because I maybe I'm extrapolating this, but I can only imagine that a student who goes to a classical school is going to be much more knowledgeable about their faith than a student who might just read a textbook for half an hour every day. What does the difference look like, particularly in the religious formation? Within that class block per se.
I can tell you what our approach is. So we are actually using from Sophia Press, Spirit of Truth as our spine text to help, guide the progression of when certain theological concepts are taught throughout the years. But, absolutely, we want our students to be in those primary texts, in the text, the book in the Bible, so that they're used to opening up their Bibles. I think that alone is so important.
Yeah.
I had a Bible that was given to me, right now, thankfully it's worn and bent and pressed because I actually use it and pray with it. But for a while it was sitting on my shelf, this Bible that I got for confirmation. And we don't want that to, we don't want our students to be unfamiliar with the inspired word of God. So we definitely want them to be in those primary texts. We want them to be familiar with the catechism too, so that they are going through and seeing wow, there's so much wisdom here. And again, and not to control me, but for my freedom, because the church deeply understands the human person and is here to guide us and how to be free and how to, follow Christ.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense too. Cause I feel you raise to the level that's expected of you. If you give a student a very difficult piece of literature instead of the excerpt, eventually they're going to figure out how to do it. They're not just going to stay confused. In a similar way with religion class, it's I'm sure at first students are reading the catechism and it's what does ecumenical mean? What's going on in this? But then eventually you start to pick it up and all of a sudden you've raised the bar in a way that calls them to greatness. But very similar to how the Lord does it in our own lives even. And
you have a guide. You have your teacher there guiding you. For me, some of the things that, I didn't experience in my own education, I'm excited that my kids aren't going to have to wait and, listen to theology podcasts in their adulthood or, have the first time they read the confessions be on their own, when it would be great to do that in community with other students and with a teacher who can guide you through that. So, I think that's a real aid. And I think it's also, speaking in terms of handing on culture, that is their heritage, our beautiful Catholic faith and all the great, wisdom of the saints, they ought to receive that. So to be able to give that to them in their Catholic education it's such a gift.
So you've been doing all this for now a semester through this school, 54 students. And I guess you've also, I can only assume, had experience of at least going to other classical schools in the process of founding this.
Absolutely.
Can you just share with me, what are some of the results of this look like? Because all this is a nice concept and it sounds great, and I believe you. But have you seen these things play out? Have you seen what these students are like on the other end of this? What can you share in terms of that?
Yeah, I mean. I will say, to the point of, reading these difficult texts and that being great for you. I was in a school in Denver, Our Lady of Lourdes Classical School, and the students in 6th grade, I believe, were reading Romeo and Juliet. I'm observing this classroom discussion, and some of the kids are really getting it and delving into it. Others are quieter, maybe, some are receiving at a more superficial level, but everybody is being enriched for having engaged with a beautiful, rich text.
To bring this back to all these questions are popping up in my head. There's probably going to be a lot of editing that needs to be done in terms of when these questions need to be asked. But to bring this back to the sacramental focus through the Mass, where else do you incorporate the sacraments throughout the classical education? Or is that kind of the main cornerstone of sacramental incorporation?
Well, certainly daily Mass, and we're so grateful to Father Sal for welcoming us into their 8:30 daily Mass. Definitely just a great way to start our day. And I would say the parish has been super welcoming to us as well. Happy to see kids on campus. So that's been great. Yeah, I mean, as we can and as the priests are available to us, opportunities for confession is wonderful too. And then adoration every Tuesday. They expose the Blessed Sacrament for adoration at the close of Mass. So, all our students, even the 3-year-olds, are there to adore our Lord, even if it's for a few moments. And then some of the older students either will stay a little bit longer and spend time in adoration, or they'll leave and come back later in the day to spend time, being in the presence of the Lord and praying.
I think this is one area that I'm very passionate about getting kids up to speed on. Like this idea, I feel like there's this subtext sometimes of like, oh, like they're not old enough for like extended adoration, or like they're not old enough. Like it almost feels like if I said like, oh, this 5th grade class is going to go do a holy hour, I feel like some people would be like, oh, like are they old enough to do that? And it's kind of like, well, you just got to do it. Like you put them in this environment that raises the bar for what's expected and what they're called to, that then frees them up to be good at it or to learn how to do it. And it sounds like that's a big focus within the sacraments, even, of like get these students up to speed on being with the Lord.
No, absolutely. I do think, a lot of it is in life is what you're used to. And I think certainly, one of the ways that I see our school and I see the, classical education is like you're trying to get your kids used to good things, get them, used to good music and used to praying and used to, reading good books and like having that be the norm. And so when they go and make their own choices of, how they're going to live their life, what they're going to choose to, do with their time, or what they're going to listen to or read or watch, that like they know what is good just intuitively. The same thing with their relationship for God. If you get them used to, you start with 5 minutes in adoration and a little bit more, you get used to spending time in prayer, punctuating your day. You get used to starting the day with daily Mass. You get used to praying the Angelus at noon. You get used to closing the school day in prayer. And those are things that I want our students to experience, is just like, so often I feel like kids have to go out and it's kind of like, okay, all the things around you that you see, like, don't do that. There's a lot of non-examples.
Yeah.
And, that's a lot to put on kids, to ask them to like, say no to everything around them. If they're in an environment where a lot of it is really good and they can just embrace it without, having to be on guard all the time and get acculturated to what's good. I think that's such a gift to them, that they can go out and have the mind of Christ and love what's good, true, and beautiful. I mean, that's what we're after.
Yeah. Which totally leads back to the idea of like it being liberating. It's like by putting these students in an environment of sacraments and good literature and a good holistic environment, it allows them to be free to not worry about it and not be on guard against it. Because even in a regular school, even in life, it's like you're so used to it being like, okay, even if my curriculum is good, like I still have to be on guard at this time of the day. I still have to be on guard about this or that. Like the more guards you can allow the students to take down, it's almost like they can unguard their mind. They can absorb everything going on around them, because they don't have to be on constant high alert of like, what should I absorb? What should I not absorb? What's good? What's bad?
Yeah, we just want them to be kids.
Yeah. I think I can even remember being exhausted as a kid of the idea of just like, man, like, what am I allowed to do? Like, what is right? What is wrong? Where it just kind of becomes like, you almost get frustrated with the idea of virtue, that it becomes such a difficult thing for children to have to get thrown into the deep end of, while not getting thrown into the deep end of the good stuff.
They haven't developed habits. So it's like we're asking them to just really like, grit through it by their will, but our will is only going to take us so far. We need habits of virtue. So yeah, certainly that of, helping them from a very young age, cultivate that so that like they're ready to go out when they're really put to the test. Like they've had opportunities to practice that. And it's been a focus of, self-mastery and growing in virtue. But yeah, we want kids to be kids. And I think, the same thing is like, obviously cell phones are like such a hot topic, and smartphones. And, we have, created a little framework for our families based on a book called The Anxious Generation, which you've probably heard of, or, maybe people who are listening, basically saying, we're not going to give our kids smartphones or their own, like personal tablet until after 8th grade, kick that can down the road and really just allow our kids to be kids while they're in elementary school, and give parents the freedom that they're not having like, well, every other kid is on TikTok or every other kid is communicating through Snapchat.
I remember the feeling.
Yeah. And it's because it's so isolating. Even if parents, which I mean, fight the good fight, but it's hard and it's isolating for the parents too. And if you as a community, this is something we require of parents. It's just a framework we offer them, and they can sign on to it or not. But we've had really great parent participation, and we just see the look of relief on parents' faces, like, oh, I'm not going to be alone. Like we're doing this together, and we can just create a culture where like it's just normal. Like none of the kids or very few, if any, have a smartphone, and so we can just have real 8-year-old friendships or 12-year-old friendships without, the interference of social media, things like that.
Yeah. Something that as you're sharing this is like, it's just this thought that students are immediately thrown into the deepest of deep ends when it comes to immorality in culture. It's like you're immediately exposed to vulgarity and bad language and just promiscuity and everything.
Absolutely.
Everything bad
like
about culture.
It seems really
block
normal.
on. But then we have this weird resistance to throwing them in the deep end of good virtue and habit. Like there's almost a weirdness again to like having kids go to daily mass, having kids go to 30-minute hour of adoration.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like they're immediately thrown into the deep end of bad culture. Why not throw them into the deep end to combat it of virtue and of good habits and of good culture and of beauty and goodness and truth? It's just like that. I feel like that's the thing that just clicked of like, that's it. Like, there's nothing more normal than that. There's nothing more good and holistic than that. Of like, if a student's going to have to be exposed to darkness, why would we not do every single thing we possibly could to expose them to goodness as early as possible?
Yeah, we want them to know the good, not just in like a cerebral way of understanding what's good, but in a poetic way of like, I've experienced what is good. And so when I go out there and something's not right, there's something bad going on, like I just know it and it feels wrong. Versus, well, this is just what people do. It's just how people live. It's just how it is.
Yeah.
It's not in God's eyes. So we want them to see the world with the mind of Christ so that they can, not feel bashful about living life, hopefully as people of virtue.
Yeah. I think that's a really great point to wrap this up of just, that's very helpful. I feel like now I know what a classical education even is. Thank you all so much. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
Very appreciative. At the end of every podcast, we clap at the same time to close it out.
Okay. Let's do this.
We are out.